the type of work Grandpa did, and how he almost got y'all into some trouble.
Okay, after the twins died, my mom got scarlet fever. So she was not in good health at all. So the doctors told her that she had to go, she needed to get out of the house. And she went out and got a job. So this, we had a neighbor that lived up above us, that Lila Dockery was her name, and she was one of Mom's good friends, and she'd come down, visit all the time. And the landlady, where we had moved to, her and her husband just all of a sudden decided to move back in with us. They had gone away when we moved into the house. They moved to Florida. And so all of a sudden they came back and they had decided they were going to be there. And so she was, every day she would say things about my mom. They stayed in the house with us for a while. And she would say bad things about Mom. And I was only 5 years old, but I took offense to that. So one day she called my mom an old heifer. And I told Mom that. So when Mom gets home from work, this lady, Mrs. Patterson was her name, and she was up trying to fix up the house that they were going to move in. So Mom goes out and meets her up by the barn. She wasn't going to have her come down where us kids were. And she confronted her with it. And of course, Dad was there watching. He didn't know what to do because Mom was really upset, and my mom never did get upset about things usually. So this old lady said something to her real smart, and she just took her hand and slapped her against the barn.
My tiny grandma.
She was a little woman too.
I'm not surprised at all.
We
That's
decided,
where the Tilley women get it.
Yeah.
we decided to, I'd never seen my mom angry like that. So we decided, Mom and Dad took us kids, and we went up to Lila's house, which was just up above where we were at, and made a plan. And so we walked across the mountain to the Murphy area, and that's where we settled down. We went to my aunt's house, Aunt Nina Killian. We went to her house and spent the night or two, and then we decided to move into my dad's an old house that they had way up on the head. We called it the head of Owl Creek. So we move into that. I mean, it was like 8 miles from town, and you had to walk about 1.5 miles into the house because you couldn't get a car up in there. Well, while we were there, I'll tell you a little story that happened. My Uncle Claude came over to visit my Aunt Toots, Mama's younger sister, was staying with us, and Claude came to visit, and my dad was working away from home, so we go to church one night. They were having a revival. And that's when my Aunt Toots became a Christian, and so we walked home. We walked to church, which was 1 mile away from home, and back home. And my uncle decided he was going to go to the restroom before he went home. Well, we lived so far out in the boonies, and there was nothing but outhouses in those days. We had no electricity. We used oil lamps. And he decided to go to the toilet. So he goes, and he's gone, and he's gone, and he's gone, and there's just my mom and her sister there, with us 3 little kids. And after a while, my little brother was only like 2.5 or 3 years old at that time. He was 3, I guess. So they sent him out to check on God. Well, Mom and Toots forgot to tell him that there was a loose board in the bottom of the toilet.
No.
So he had gone in there in the dark and he fell in the toilet.
Oh.
So he couldn't come back in the house. So he had to go to the creek and jump in. Good thing it was not middle of winter. And
Oh my goodness.
so that's how my Uncle Claude and Aunt Toots got together. So during that time, my dad, he was working at a mill in Murphy and making like $1 an hour, $1.50 an hour, something like that. So it wasn't enough to keep his family going, and he decided he would make himself some liquor and sell it. So here I am, 5 years, well, I wasn't 5 at that time. At that time I was about 6. So I can remember holding the aluminum, he used those copper, I guess it was, copper. He would make copper hoses to run the stuff through, and he built this big round steel, and I would hold it for him because he did it right by the kitchen stove, and he had to have the soldering iron. He had to keep it hot all the time, and he'd solder this stuff too with they did everything really backwoodsy back in those days. Nobody probably knows what solder is these days. But it's just like a glue, only you put it on with hot iron. And so I helped him build his steel. Never did get to see that steel for a long, long time. After we moved, a little bit later, he bought this farm, a 120-acre farm, and this steel was on that property. So when I was about 8 and a half, the revenuers came in. We saw all this string of cars coming up the road, and well, they didn't drive past our house because the pasture was right out here in front of the house, and there was a gate and everything, so they didn't try to drive up to it. But they had parked their cars below our house. I was out on the back porch, me and my sister Eloise, and we saw them coming. We told Mom and Dad there's cars coming up the road, and we hadn't been used to that because we didn't have a car at that time. So they get out, and there's people with cameras and all this stuff, and they walked right by our house. So Dad had some of his whiskey stored in the extra bedroom. He had Mom hand it out to him. He took it up on the hill and hid it. Well, nobody knew that belonged to him. Nobody had any idea who it belonged to. But he was so upset, he found out that his best friend, whose name was Willard Capehart, came along and he was hunting, and he found that steel. So he reported it. And Dad thought he knew it was his. He didn't know. So he gets his gun, and he goes out looking for Willard. So he walks across the mountain to my aunt, over to the other side of over where we used to live before that, where my aunt and uncle or aunts lived over there. And so he went over, and on the way he met this guy by the name of Richard Hass, who was his stepsister's son, and he had left North Carolina and moved to South Carolina, I think, or maybe Ohio, someplace in there, and he became a minister while he was gone. So he met my dad in the middle of the road carrying this gun, and he asked him what he was doing, and he told him that he was going to go kill Willard because he had turned his still in. He couldn't believe his best friend had done that to him. So Richard started talking to him about Jesus. And the longer he talked, the more convicted my dad got, and pretty soon he's down on his knees right there in the middle of this old dirt road and committed his heart to the Lord. He come home carrying his gun, crying like a baby. Put his arm around Mom, and he was telling her what happened. He'd met Jesus and all that stuff. And so me and my sister couldn't hear what he was saying. And we were scared to death. We were hanging back on the porch just watching to see. Because we thought a few months before that, my grandpa McDonald had passed away. And Dad had come home from work and told Mom, and I can remember her falling over on the bed and crying and all that stuff. And I thought that was what had happened there, that my grandmother had died. So me and Eloise are just huddling together, crying our eyes out. After a while, he gets us by the hand, and Mom gets Leo by the hand, and he takes us up to the apple orchard, which was, we had this little trail around by the house, above the house, which took us to the spring where we carried our water from, and had a spring box out there and everything, and then the apple orchard was right above it. So we go out there, and he has us all sit down around under the apple tree, and we're eating apples, and he tells us about what he was doing and how he met Jesus on the way. So from there on, my dad was a different person. So he, a few months later, or not long after, maybe a month or two later, his brothers were going to Oregon, so he decided he would go with them. But in the meantime, they were hauling this steel all over Murphy, showing it off. They didn't know who it belonged to.
The authorities were doing
Yes,
that?
the sheriff's department was doing that. And, but they were talking about what a good job that the person had done on that still. And nobody ever knew that it was his. So consequently, that was in 1948, and his brothers were moving to Oregon, so he decided to get in and go with them and get a job, because they told him he could get a really good job out there. Is it time yet?
Good.
So, he goes out with them, and 6 weeks later, he sent money for us to come on the train to Oregon. And we get on the train. Well, actually, we go to Murphy and ride the bus. I had never been out of Murphy that I remembered to go anywhere after I got big enough to remember. So we ride the bus to Chattanooga and get on the train and head for Oregon. And what a ride it was. My little brother was so wild. He was 3.5 years old when we had So he'd go in the bathroom and he'd lock the door. And at each stop, the porter had to come and check the bathrooms out to see that nobody was in there, because you couldn't be in the restroom when the train stopped, because somebody could get injured, so you had to be in your seat. So one day, stop there, the porter came by as a very big old guy, and tried to open the door to the restroom, and it wouldn't open, and Leo said, everybody all over the car heard him yelling, "You can't come in here, I got my britches off." Leo came out of the restroom, and he's climbing all over the seats and everything, and one of the ladies that was sitting on the other side of my mother turned around to her and said, because Mom had told her we're from Murphy, and she said, "Well, your daughters, they are very well behaved, but he is very backwoodsy." And so Mom was embarrassed at that. But anyway, we go on to Chicago. That was our we go back to the train. We get into Portland, Oregon, and that's where my dad was supposed to meet us. And of course, this is all strange to us, because we'd never been to big cities or anything before that. So Dad was there to meet us, At 10 o'clock in the morning when we got in, at 10 o'clock that night, we're still sitting there waiting for him. All day long he searched for us
Oh, man.
because he didn't know us. Us kids, Mom had us over in the corner kind of, that she had never had her hair cut. And just before we left, her sister had cut her hair and put a perm in it. So my dad didn't know my mom. I mean, he would have, if he'd been up close to her, but he just didn't see. He walked past us many times, I guess, and we were waiting for him to come and get us. We didn't know what to do. And there was no telephones or anything during those days, and nobody carried a phone. So,
That had to be a scary
that
day.
late that night, we got home about 10 o'clock that night. And
How did he finally recognize you? How did he finally recognize you?
Or did you guys see him?
Mom happened to walk over she was gonna go try to check with some authorities there anyway, trying to find somebody, and she happened to walk right by him. He's walking down, looking, trying to find her. She just reached out and got a hold of him, and he turned around like he was gonna hit her. He thought somebody was trying to pick his pockets or something, because she just reached out and got hold of his back pocket. And so he took us back over to Disston, Oregon. He had a house all set up for us, and we'd go there across the river. We had to walk across this little river on a swinging bridge. We went across there, and so that's where we lived in our first house at Disston, and he was working for the first time in his life. He was making good money. He went from making $1.50 an hour to making $110 a day.
Oh, wow, that was
So,
good for back then.
Yes, it was.
Wow.
Rich.
So that was our first episode in North Carolina. I mean, in Oregon, from North Carolina to Oregon. And let me see.
How long did you stay that time? I mean, did you?
Oh, we lived there for 2 years. And Dad thought he'd made enough money to make it for a long time on his farm, because we raised everything we ate there on the farm, you know. And so we just left everything just like it was, furniture and everything. It had a crib to keep all the corn and stuff in, right down below the house, and we had a barn, and we had a big pasture, and
That's in North
chicken
Carolina?
in North Carolina, and a chicken coop all right over inside the pasture area. And my sister and I used to go out, and we had a pig pen where he raised his pigs, and that's in the fall of the year they would kill the pigs and cure the meat. They'd smoke it, and the only thing we'd go to the store for back there was to get the sugar and flour and lard. So, and in fact, Mom rendered most of the lard that we had from the pigs. So everybody used that kind of, lard back in those days. That was how they seasoned their food with. So, and he'd buy pinto beans sometimes at the store, but he'd go once a month to the store, and that was it. But we raised everything else in the garden. But we went back to North Carolina in 1950, I guess it was 1951. And then in 52, we turned around and went back to Oregon, and that's where we were raised.
A lot of traveling.
Yeah, because we just could not make it there. He didn't think, so he sold his farm, 120 acres, for $600 to his brother. And he also owned 38 acres of property, who he sold to another brother. And they
And
built
y'all
their,
would have been totally rich by.
oh, I know. So anyway, we were raised up there in Oregon then. And then when Opally came along, we got married, and we got married in the little church at Disston. And now, when we moved there, there was no church there. But, that, when we first moved out there, and then, in the mid-50s, they built a church there. And it's called Full Gospel Fellowship, and the pastor's name was Barney Dodd. So that's when Ophelia came up to see him, and we met, and we got married there. Went to California. That was my first experience in San Francisco.
We went